Thanks for joining us on the Cultured Meat and Future Food Show. I'm excited to have John Sanbonmatsu as the guest for today's episode. John is Associate Professor of Philosophy at WPI in Massachusetts, where he teaches ethics, political theory, and the philosophy of technology. He is author of the book The Postmodern Prince: Critical Theory, Left Strategy, and the Making of the New Political Subject, editor of the book Critical Theory and Animal Liberation, and he is the creator and curator of www.cleanmeat-hoax.com. That dash is important, and you'll hear more about that on this episode. His new book, The Omnivore's Deception: What We Get Wrong About Meat, Animals, and the Nature of Moral Life, is expected to be released at the end of 2022. I had a very interesting and unique conversation with John on this episode, and I'm excited to share it with you. Let's get started. Thanks so much for joining us on the Cultured Meat and Future Food Show. This is your host, Alex, and we're excited to be here with John Sanbonmatsu. John, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks a lot for having me, Alex.
John, before we jump right into things, tell us a little bit about your background.
I'm a professor at Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Massachusetts, where I teach philosophy. So that includes ethics, political theory, critical theory, philosophy of technology, and some other things. And I've been part of the animal rights movement for 30 years, been a vegan during that time. And I'm the editor of the book, Critical Theory and Animal Liberation, a collection of essays by different authors showing the relationship between human domination of animals and other forms of injustice and structural oppression. And I'm at work at the moment on a new book called The Omnivore's Deception: What We Get Wrong About Meat, Animals, and the Nature of Moral Life.
Great. And the word deception is something that I do want us to dig into for a couple different reasons. But how you and I started talking was through the website CleanMeat-Hoax.com. And so tell us what that website is and why it's important to start a website like that.
Sure. So a few years ago, I was contacted by my friend Karen Davis, who is one of the leading figures in the animal rights movement. She is the founder and director of United Poultry Concerns. And she wanted to know my opinion about something she'd been learning about, which is cellular meat, synthesized flesh. And I had never really thought about it. So I looked into it and I was disturbed by what I saw. And from that kind of series of conversations with Karen, and she published something of mine in her newsletter, she invited me to come out to Berkeley for a debate. So it was 4 people involved in that. On one side, against the idea that cellular meat was good for animals. On one side was myself and Vasily Stanescu, who's a wonderful scholar in critical animal studies. And on the other side was Leah Garces of Mercy for Animals and Bruce Friedrich of the Good Food Institute. So it was for that debate that I felt it was important to have a resource that kind of brought under one roof some of the problems or questions that we need to be asking about this new technology. So on that site, there were perhaps 10 or 12 different arguments about why this is maybe not a great idea in terms of abolishing the animal economy. So the site it's a joint venture between myself and about a dozen other animal studies scholars and activists from around the world, and they all contributed in various ways to the website.
Great. And I think, at first glance, when I hear the word hoax, right? Hoax is a pretty strong word. And so I looked up the word hoax. First definition Google gives me is a humorous or malicious deception. And I think deception is an interesting word when you are talking about future technologies, because there are all of these promises that really great things will happen. And oftentimes we don't know if those will come to be true. And so I think on the Clean Meat-Hoax website, there's a couple arguments, and all these arguments do make sense. Can you tell me about some of these arguments against the idea of cultured meat? And I do want to say, you use the term synthesized meat. It's funny how often when we look at search results for either the podcast or any other kind of cultured meat related analytics that we have, the term synthesized meat, synthetic meat and artificial meat are oftentimes the most used terms to get to cultured meat content. And so that's definitely what people think of when they think of this technology, lab grown meat or whatever it may be. But can you tell us a little bit about, or give us a few examples of some of these arguments?
And let me, since you asked about the question of deception and hoax, let me clarify that a little bit. Until a week or two ago, I had simply been taking it on faith, the claims being made by proponents of this technology that it was feasible and scalable, because I think there are so many problems with the way it's being developed and marketed and the way meat companies are involved. And I'll go into that in a minute. There are all these other problems that I and others have been concerned about that I wasn't really keying into the basic question of the science and what we're told is possible actually is possible. So I read this article, which I highly recommend, by Joe Fassler that appeared in The Counter online magazine. And Fassler interviewed a chemical engineer named David Humbird, who spent years researching a report sponsored by the Open Philanthropy Project about cellular meat. And let me just quote very briefly from that article. Fassler says that Humbird, the chemical engineer, quote, found that the cell culture process will be plagued by extreme, intractable technical challenges at food scale. Humbird likened the process of researching the report to encountering an impenetrable wall of no, his term, for the barriers in thermodynamics, cell metabolism, bioreactor design, ingredient costs, facility construction, and other factors that will need to be overcome before cultivated protein can be produced cheaply enough to displace traditional meat, unquote. Now, of course, no one's a prophet. No one can look into the future. However, the way that entrepreneurs are selling this technology is as a certain thing, and they're asking and getting millions, if not billions of dollars in investment capital for this. They're telling the public that this is going to happen. And meanwhile, I'm very concerned about the way that this discourse is seriously distorting animal advocacy movements throughout the world, that this has become a kind of stand-in for an effective strategy. Now, as Fassler goes on to explain, even under the best case scenarios, and this is something that, say, the Good Food Institute, which is the leading lobbying group for this technology, even under the best case scenario in perhaps 10 years, as he explains, the largest facility that they are imagining would produce about 10,000 metric tons or 22 million pounds of cultured meat per year, which is, first of all, that it would be an unparalleled engineering feat. The biotechnology industry has never produced a biosafe facility on anything like that scale. But assuming, this is the best case scenario, let's assume the GFI is right and they can do that. As Fassler points out, quote, for context, that volume would represent just over 10% of the domestic market for plant-based meat alternatives. Only 10% of the plant-based meat alternatives. And yet that 22 million pounds of cultured protein, as he points out, barely registers within the context of conventional meat. Quote, it's only about 0.0002 or 1/50th of 1% of the 100 billion pounds of meat produced in the US each year. Now, Fassler's conclusions jibe with other studies. For example, a report released this summer by McKinsey and Company, one of the world's largest management consulting firms, guessed that a decade from now, based on everything that we know, and if everything goes according to plan, which is a big question, they also confirmed that cellular meats would replace only, at most, 0.5% of the total market in meat, which is already, that's better than what Fassler's reporting there, but it's still pretty much inconsequential. And in the meantime, of course, during that same period, 9 to 30 trillion animals will die violently at human hands. So from an animal advocacy point of view, this is simply a tremendous distraction. And what few people realize is that the cellular meat juggernaut is being welcomed by the meat industry because with population growth and the growing economies of China and India, demand for animal flesh and animal products is exploding around the world. And experts are anticipating at least double the demand that currently exists in the next 20 to 30 years. Let me just quote a couple of people on this kind of strategy. Here's Matthew Walker, who's managing director at S2G Ventures, a high-tech venture capitalist firm investing in alternative proteins. He says, quote, we're taking a yes and as opposed to an either or approach to the space, the protein space. Quote, you will have animal-based meat, plant-based meat, and you will have hybrid products. Similarly, in 2019, Renee Vassilos, an agricultural economist with the Banyan Innovation Group, told attendees at the National Institute for Animal Agriculture, quote, alternative proteins from insects to legumes to cell cultures are not something to view as a replacement for live animal proteins, but as just another competitor in the huge global protein market. And we see this, in fact, very clearly stated in the business strategies of the big agribusiness interests. For example, Cargill, which is the largest agribusiness company in the world, has issued a press statement just a few years ago saying that it's planning to, quote, grow our traditional protein business, which means to say factory farming. They're going to grow that while also exploring new proteins and alternatives. At Cargill, we recognize that meat is a core part of consumer diets and central to many cultures and traditions. Our traditional proteins, they mean from live, living animals, as well as new innovations like cultured meats, they write, are both necessary to meet that demand. And in that same release, Cargill noted that it was investing nearly $600 million in factory farming infrastructure. In other words, they're expanding factory farming to the extent that they can. And they emphasized that such investments were meant to, quote, underscore Cargill's overarching commitment to animal protein. So I would just ask your listeners, does that sound like the meat industry, which, by the way, has very well-paid consultants and experts and technologists who have examined this issue very carefully? Does that sound to you like they think that conventional animal agriculture is going away anytime soon? And of course it doesn't.
That article was one that the industry needed. We just don't see enough articles like this. And I think even the proponents, I don't want to say just the word proponents, I'll specifically say the founders of cultured meat companies, a lot of them have released statements saying, I absolutely agree with Joe's conclusions. And I think that if you look at some of the other arguments as to why cultured meat and why it's not a good idea, and a few of those listed that we'll talk about, mostly as it relates to animal agriculture, George from VOW, he's the CEO of a company in Australia. He goes on to say, yeah, cultured meat is not going to be the cheap meat that you buy in the store. And he uses an interesting example of, whereas animal agriculture is Bud Light, which is this cheap beer that you buy, there are also craft beers that are much smaller in distribution. You pay a lot more for. Cell cultured meat could be like that craft beer, for example. But you're right, this ends up being kind of a supplement to meat and animal agriculture, at least in the short term and the medium term, and maybe even the next 100 years. So it's interesting to look at the messaging that's out there for cultured meat now, but then the reality of what this technology is. And yes, there are these broader visions, some visions that might not even with current technology, as Joe pointed out, and even maybe future technology will have caps in terms of creation. So thank you for extracting those elements from that article out. It really makes me think of the idea of these arguments for cultured meat. So for example, as we're discussing, ending factory farming, or no animal will get hurt through this process. And there's a video on the videos section of the CleanMeat-Hoax website where there are a lot of these discussions. And I think the video was from 2019, not too long ago, but still every point that is made is a valid point. Can you tell us a little bit deeper into some of these arguments as to why cultured meat doesn't mix with the idea of animal advocacy?
Yeah, thank you. Before I answer that, I just wanted to say that on this question of deception and hoax, reading the Fassler article made me think for the first time of the Theranos debacle, where you had this visionary in Silicon Valley who had a special way of testing for diseases based on a single drop of blood and so on, and turned out to be a fraud. And I'm not saying that, again, no one can predict the future, but right now, the way this has been built up, I am wondering if the whole bottom is going to fall out the way it did with the Theranos thing. But at any rate, the big problem here is that we've seen that the experts say that at best, the best case scenario is that this technology will replace something like 0.0002% of the American meat market, to say nothing of the world meat market in 10 or 20 years. Here's the thing. This discourse, that is to say, not just the discourse, but the technology, the investment capital, the press coverage, which has been extraordinary, all of that is sucking the air out of the room. So even though this technology will at best have a negligible effect on the mass extermination of our fellow beings, the horrific suffering and killing of trillions of animals every year, in spite of the fact that it will have a negligible effect on that killing and suffering, it's taking up an outsized proportion of the discursive space in our culture. What do I mean? I mean that we're in the middle of what I would describe as a legitimation crisis of the meat economy, the animal economy. As you're aware, Alex, the animal agriculture and the fisheries are destroying life on Earth. Those are the two biggest sources of ecological harm on the planet, even worse than climate change in terms of species extinction and biodiversity and habitat loss and disappearance of scarce resources and so on. So we have this crisis of the legitimacy around meat. So what is the society doing but trying to mobilize a defense of this indefensible system? And my concern about the cellular meat culture that's been put onto the public, has steamrolled over the animal rights movement in certain ways, is that, as I said, it's a distraction, and it's also, in this not so subtle way, reinforcing meat culture. That is to say, actual animal culture. Stephen Eisenman, who's one of the contributors to our website, Clean Meat Hoax, who founded an organization with his wife called the Anthropocene Alliance, has written, quote, "Promoters of fake meat are implicitly telling consumers that their appetite for meat must forever be gratified, regardless of the cost." So, for example, Culture Decadence, which is a company that bioengineers cultured cells of marine animals, describes traditional seafood, quote unquote, that is to say, food from live animals who lived in the sea and were taken out and killed, quote, "Seafood is a decadent, delicious, and nutritious source of protein, recommended by doctors and dietitians as part of a healthy diet," unquote. In other words, you have this company that's saying, yes, it's affirming the eating of marine animals because it's decadent, delicious, and nutritious. And by the way, it's recommended by experts. And then, of course, what they're saying is, oh, but you should buy our version, which doesn't use real fish. Since this isn't scalable, there's no evidence that this is scalable. What they're doing is robbing Peter to pay Paul. Even though their heart may be in the right place, I don't know, but they're advocating the replacement of animals. At the same time, they're weirdly reinforcing meat culture. And what's so strange, Alex, is that to me, this is a classic case of snatching defeat from the jaws of possible victory, which is to say, we are living in this incredible, amidst this explosion of interest in plant-based foods. It's amazing. You know, big steakhouses in New York City are becoming vegan. There's never been more access to vegan plant-based products, as you know. Cheeses and milks, unbelievable. I can go to my local CVS pharmacy or drugstore here in the Boston area, and they sell Beyond Meat sausages and patties. They sell Oatly vegan ice cream and soy milk. Unbelievable. I never thought I'd see that in a million years. And so here we have this incredible shift that's underway, and we have the cellular meat people just completely undermining that, because it's very easy to see the distinction between plants and animals. That's not merely a semiotic distinction, that's ontological. What do I mean? I mean that plants and animals are completely different kinds of beings. Animals are conscious. Plants, as far as we know, are not conscious. Animals have experiences. As far as we know, plants don't have experiences. The cellular meat stuff and the hybrid meat products blur these distinctions in the minds of consumers at the very moment when they should be getting a clear message that it's time to say goodbye to the animal economy, as we don't need to eat these beings. We don't need to eat them, whether the flesh is reproduced in a lab or it's on a feedlot. Many, many alternatives. They've been vegans for over 1,000 years. So at any rate, that's one of the problems with this, as I see it.
I want to pause for a second and ask you what you think about Impossible Burger or even Beyond Burger. What are your thoughts on these types of foods?
So I completely support these foods. I mean, there were activists like Vandana Shiva, the feminist ecological activists, who were very critical of processed foods of all kind, including vegan foods. And I understand that critique and I share that critique. However, it's really important that the public begin to understand, as they are beginning to understand, that to be a vegan doesn't mean eating a slab of white tofu and some wilted greens, right? There's been this way in which tofu has signified as this effeminate commodity and something that's gross and that only sissies eat kind of thing. So the fact that Beyond Meat has these wonderful commercials where you see people barbecuing and stuff, I think this is a transitional moment in food culture. So I think that just as infants need transitional objects, we need transitional objects to move away from eating animals. That said, there's no chance that a consumer based movement of veganism is going to end the animal economy on its own. No chance whatsoever. In the same way that the organic foods industry, which has been around for a century, has not displaced the conventional food industry, right? Organic foods, I can't remember, make up maybe 9% or less of the total food market in the United States. It's almost negligible. So it's not as though, okay, once we have organic foods, then conventional foods will fade away. Similarly, what's happening is that meat eaters are finding that they love the Beyond Beef burger, but they're still eating at McDonald's. They're still eating chicken. Why? Because nobody has made a good enough argument from their point of view for why it's wrong to kill and eat animals. That is our challenge. Until we can begin to deconstruct and tear down this idea that humans have a natural right to dominate and destroy other beings, we're just spinning in the wind. No matter how many wonderful vegan products come out, they're just going to be sitting there alongside the conventional animal products. So again, the more and more we talk about cellular meat as the solution, the Hail Mary pass, the more it's distracting us from the actual work that needs to be done, which is to dismantle this system of what I and others call speciesism or human dominance.
I want us to imagine this world where, we're far into the future. Animal agriculture has been replaced with cultured meat. And now the number of animals that are suffering, dying for food has drastically reduced. Wouldn't that be a better world if we could achieve that?
That is an argument that Bruce Friedrich and others who have bought into Peter Singer's utilitarianism as well as effective altruism will argue. I mean, I had a dinner with Bruce Friedrich after the debate in Berkeley that we were talking about. He said, wouldn't you agree that, 20 billion animals dying is better than 50 billion animals dying? I don't know if it's better. If that's the choice, then of course we will always have to choose the 20 over the 50. But suppose that there had been an intervention in the 1940s, and instead of Hitler being able to kill 6 million Jews in Europe, had only, quote, only been able to kill 3 million. Would we call that success? No, we would still call that genocide. Martin Luther King famously, in his letter from Birmingham jail, said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So long as there is a single animal who is being abused, tormented, killed, then that's a challenge for all of us. It is unacceptable to me and to many, many other animal advocates, absolutely unacceptable to think about such a future in which we would consider the ruthless killings of billions of our fellow sensitive creatures as some kind of success or as a good situation. Again, there's no doubt that if 3 million Jews had died rather than 6 million Jews, is that better? Again, if we had that choice, then of course we would choose the 3, but it would still be one of the greatest stains on human civilization. Can't erase that. And the same I would say for these kinds of arguments that, we should settle for that. We should settle for only half as many animals being killed. And by the way, because of the growth of the animal economy and demand for meat right now, A.T. Kearney, in its report last summer, pointed out that when I spoke to the author of that report, he confirmed for me that, basically the same number of animals who are dying today will be dying 20 years from now, even with the growth of vegan products and cellular meat products, simply because the market is expanding. To me, that is the question, is are we going to accept a world in which domination and extreme mass violence is the basis for human existence, or are we going to choose a different form of life, one that's based on compassion and respect for other living beings?
And if I were to ask the same question, but instead of cultured meat, we have now these 100% plant-based meats like Impossible Burger, chicken nuggets, even McDonald's is fully plant-based. Perhaps you can agree that would be a much better place.
Certainly, if we were able to get people to shift away to a purely plant based diet, then that would mean that trillions of animals' lives would be saved every year. Yes. Now, that said, we still have our work cut out for us because the nature of the world capitalist system is to cannibalize nature and to destroy everything. So even if we moved to a purely plant based society, we would still have the problem of mass species extinction and so forth. Now, as I said, if animal agriculture and the fisheries industries were defunct, then certainly that would ease up a lot of the ecological catastrophes that we're seeing. But unfortunately, capitalism has its own dynamic in addition to what we're seeing in the animal economy. So just to be clear, I wouldn't say that if the world became vegan in the next, 20 years, that would be the end of our troubles here on planet Earth. But it would be a huge relief for animals and, of course, for the Earth's ecology.
I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about this idea of humane slaughter because for me, it was very interesting not being in the movement and doing research and seeing that a lot of people that are talking about humane slaughter are in the meat industry, and animal welfare is a kind of division of the meat industry, which seemed a little bit strange to me. But I guess there's this idea in the meat industry of humane slaughter. And so tell us what humane slaughter is and perhaps what it isn't.
So, from the very beginning of human domination over other beings, in ancient cultures, there had to be propitiatory rites, in other words, rites of religious observance, pagan rituals, and so forth, to make us feel comfortable with taking life. So, the idea that you pray to the animal or you thank the animal, or in the Old Testament, the ancient Jews having certain strictures, like that oxen needed to be rested on the seventh day or something like that. The idea of, quote, animal welfare is not in itself new. But what's happened is it's very ironic, but the same people who are now in this cellular meat space, people like Paul Shapiro, Nick Cooney, Wayne Pacelli, Bruce Friedrich, these were all people who in the 1990s and 2000s began pushing for this kind of welfarist approach within animal advocacy that emphasized changes not in the fundamental structures of animal agriculture, but reforms that would lead to so-called more humane treatment of animals. Not just humane slaughter, but supposedly humane conditions of raising them and so forth. Now, we don't have time for me to go into all that, except to say that the whole thing has been terribly damaging to animals in a variety of ways. It's reinforced the idea that there are kind ways of exploitation, humane ways of killing. The last group of people who claimed that it was humane to kill people, and that was the best thing to do to them, was in fact the Nazis, and before the Nazis, two German academics in the 1920s who advocated euthanasia for disabled humans. And so, I think your listeners can see the clear contradiction between supposedly caring about a being and then seeking that being's destruction. I have a kid, and my job as a parent is to do the best I can by him and to care for him. And the idea that I would intentionally harm him would be a complete contradiction to that. One of the things I find disturbing about, say, the Good Food Institute's approach is that its director, Bruce Friedrich, has said openly that cellular meat technology is not a threat to regenerative animal agriculture, small-scale animal agriculture. But we know from just lots of investigative reports that this is just a myth, that animals are still brutalized, even on small farms. There have been cases, for example, at Chipotle's, the Mexican food chain, that claim to be sourcing, quote, ethically sourced, organic, humane meat. Turns out that some of their suppliers were engaged in atrocities against animals, and that, in fact, in some cases, the company at some of the stores would use Tyson's chicken, say, and just tear off the labels and stick on a label from a different supplier to make it look like it was humane. So again, I think the central contradiction in the idea of humane slaughter, and it speaks for itself, it's an oxymoron. You can't care for a being and want to harm that being at the same time. It's just an intractable contradiction.
It kind of goes back to thinking about that question of 20 billion versus 50 billion. Even 20 billion is not acceptable. And I guess if you're talking about the chicken that's in the cage or not in a cage, but still in a cramped coop, it's still not acceptable. But of course, if we were to choose, we would always choose 20 billion over 50 billion.
But the problem is that the public is being given a false message here, or a destructive message. Because, look, if you want to get people to change their behavior, whether to buy cellular meat products or vegan meat products, bottom line is you have to get people to understand who and what the other animals are, that they're not things, they're persons, they're individuals, they have individual personalities and consciousness and experiences and interests. And so if we just say, well, 20 billion, well, we're only going to kill 20 billion, not 100 billion, what is the message there? Well, implicitly, it's saying that killing 20 billion animals, we would never say that, well, suppose we say we're going to kill 5 million children, but not 10 million children. And we're going to call it a day. If someone's trying to convince me, who's complicit in this child murdering, to change my behavior, the message is, yeah, you should care, but not so much, really. Because at the end of the day, we can live with just 5 million kids being murdered. There's no incentive psychologically, spiritually, existentially, for people to rethink their entire worldview. And that is what the animal liberation movement is trying to do. It's trying to create the basis for a new form of human civilization. And I know that's a tough order. And I'm not saying that we're going to win this struggle, but if we want to have a livable world and a just world, then that's the path we have to go down.
I've had discussions with a few folks that if we ban animal agriculture by the year 2100, then that might give us enough time to solve the problem. Of course, we don't know, but
No, that's patently false. We're in the beginning of the greatest mass species extinction event in 65 million years, not since dinosaurs were wiped out by an asteroid in the Yucatan, what's now the Yucatan Peninsula. So that's actually patently false. We don't have any time. We don't have a century. We don't have 50 years. There's going to be nothing left. All the animals on the earth are dying. Reptiles, amphibians, mammals, avians, crustaceans, horseshoe crabs, who've been denizens of the earth for hundreds of millions of years. They were here, or maybe a billion years long. They were here hundreds of millions of years before the dinosaurs were. They have been wiped out just in the last few decades. So you have this intersection of these two great forces of capitalist expansion and what I call speciesism, or human extermination as violence. And they're like entwined. It's like a DNA helix. You have these two strands that are working in tandem to destroy all life on Earth. And as I said, animal agriculture and fisheries are the biggest culprits. So we don't have that kind of time. That's just absurd. We just don't have it. All the insects are dying. And insects, of course, invertebrates make up 95% or more of all animals on the earth. We've lost, estimates are 60 to 80% of all insects on the earth in my lifetime. This is the end game. This is the end game for terrestrial conscious life as we know it. And that's the message we need to get to people. People don't understand the depth of this crisis. They don't understand the urgency of the crisis. Scientists are warning, we cannot continue like this, or there'll be no way for us to survive. There'll be no human agriculture. There'll be no agriculture because you need insects to pollinate. We have to reject these pie in the sky projections. Oh, maybe in 50 years, 20 years, if this technology works, if this happens, etc. It's like an all hands on deck moment in terms of our society. We've got to get the word out there, and we've got to build a movement.
As we wrap up, I kind of wanted to get back to the idea of messaging. You heard me say CleanMeat-Hoax.com, emphasizing the dash. When you go to CleanMeatHoax.com, that goes to the GFI website.
Whoa. Say that again? What?
If you go to CleanMeatHoax.com.
Without the dash.
Without the dash.
That is a beautiful, sinister thing. And as we say on our website, with all humility, who's the GFI? They are getting tens of millions of dollars a year, tens of millions of dollars to promote and develop these technologies. We, collectively, the 12 of us, have spent about $70 on our website. It's David versus Goliath. But even that isn't enough. No, that's not enough. We aren't given op-ed space in the New York Times, as these people are. We're not interviewed by the big media places. We're not on NPR. And yet we're a threat. We're such a threat, even any tiny little threat, that we have to be crushed. So they bought this, obviously, the domain name of Clean Meat Hoax without the dash, in order to steal traffic from our modest little site. That is incredible. I'm not surprised, but it says everything that one needs to say about the nefarious nature of this whole thing.
You can learn more about John on LinkedIn and, of course, learn more about CleanMeatHoax.com at CleanMeat-Hoax.com. John, I'd love to continue the conversation sometime about speciesism and a couple different topics. But for today, do you have any last insights or announcements for our listeners?
No, I just want to thank you, Alex, for having me. And I guess I'd just say to folks who are fascinated by this technology, hold on to your wallet. Just be aware that all that glitters is not gold.
John, thank you for the perspective, and thanks for joining us on the Cultured Meat and Future Food Show.
Thanks a lot, Alex. Take care.
This is your host, Alex, and we look forward to seeing you on our next episode.
This program was produced by H Media. We'll see you soon.